I think and certainly do agree with my good friend from Alabama. He's done a great job on this subject. I would like to say that one of the things I enjoyed about the presentation that was made by my good friend from Texas, Senator Cruz, was that we were in a position that's very rare in this body where we could talk as long as we wanted to. In fact, we actually tried to talk longer, and we're looking for different things to fill in we may have forgotten. Now, that's not where we are today, and so we are confined. But I have to share with my good friend in the chair that something I'm going to say now is going to be very offensive to a lot of people, but I really don't care. Because at my age and being here, I think I know what this country is all about, and I think I know that we have the obligation to express our true feelings. I have written a speech and have put it off, and I'm not going to give it today, but I was rereading it this morning. I had no intention of coming down and talking because I talked long enough during the course of the cruise talk. But I went back and reread the speech that I was going to give, and what it is to answer the question. It really, one of my sons said to me, and everyone has been saying this over a period of time in Oklahoma. I don't think Oklahoma is that different from other states. But they ask me over and over and over again, they say, what happened? Why is it that we have an administration and people in government, not just the Obama administration, but others, who are praising Islam and trashing Christianity or trashing the Judeo-Christian values and the other things that are happening today? And we all know it's true. You know, how do you answer that? It's a tough answer. So I was going to make, I'm preparing, and I'm going to, later on, I'll give you a little warning, I'll be making a talk. I've done a lot of research on this. There's a guy named Paul Johnson who wrote The History of the American People. In that, he talks about how we got where we are today. Now, this is going to tie into ObamaCare, but and he says that the Puritans were devoted to and single-minded to their ambition of creating a colony that was built upon the foundation and teachings of Jesus Christ. The Mayflower Compact is evidence of this, and Paul Johnson, the guy who wrote that the book I told you about, is right to observe that the document was not just a contract between a servant and a master, or a people and a king, but between a group of like-minded individuals with God as a witness and symbolic co-signatory. And why is this important? It's important because William Bradford and the other Puritans understood that while forming a civil government was fully within their right, there were limitations to what they could and could not do. They're talking about government here. And those limitations were established by God and enumerated in the Bible. I go on when I make my talk on this, I quote the Apostle Paul in Romans, but there's not time for that. I'm going to go on to say it is within the foundation of the biblical authority that the Puritans crafted the Mayflower Compact and their system of government at Plymouth Colony. Paul Johnson rightly observes that this line and model of thinking was critical to laying the foundation for a successful United States of America. And ultimately, it is a morality derived from God that had its strongest enduring influence over the nation. And this is what has crafted our history as a strong nation. I say all of this as a predicate to the answer that people ask me, why is it that we're trashing our Judeo-Christian values in favor of something that was not American to start with. And sadly, our nation does not have the same belief today that we had back during during that time in our history. We've become arrogant, inward-focused individuals. Rather than submit to God's authority and definitions of truth, justice, and goodness, as we conduct our government's business, we have replaced them with our own ideals, defined by what feels right at the time. As Americans, we now look inward to ourselves to define with fluidity and foundation of truth. We have allowed ourselves to become ultimate arbiters of what is right and wrong instead of the higher morality of God. And lastly, what's was going to be in this talk, and this time getting back to the subject at hand, Today, instead of having leaders who are protecting the church from government, we have leaders who believe it's government's job to impose on churches what should be universally upheld as truth, instead of leaders who are protecting an American's freedom to practice his or her religion on their choice. Now, here I'm not talking about the choice you may be thinking about. They are instead using government institutions and law to force them to do or buy things that are in very violation to their religious and conscious beliefs. Now, that's the issue we're talking about now. Government has become so strong and influential in our lives that we are losing our powers, and these are our ordained powers that we know we're part of this country. We know all about it. There's not a person in here who didn't study the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower and having that meeting in the captain's chamber and making these decisions, and now where we are today. And I'm going to give you an example, because I have a friend in Oklahoma whose name is David Green. David Green started a company called Hobby Lobby. Now, David Green and his wife started this company by making picture frames in their garage, and then they had the first store was 300 square feet, and it was opened with the profits that they made in their little garage operation, making picture frames. Over the years, their business has grown to 550 stores. It has annual revenues of $2.5 billion. And David Green has had success despite running his business in a very counter-cultural way. For instance, all of the retail stores close at 8 p.m. each night and all day on Sundays so employees can spend time with their families. This is appreciated by the company's 16,000 employees, it all started in the garage, who are paid at a minimum of $12 an hour despite what they could be paying a much lower rate, legal rate. At one point, the company was challenged by a competitor who said they would bury Hobby Lobby with their money, so the firm opened its stores on Sundays, ultimately earning the company an additional $100 million in revenue each week. But eventually, David Green was challenged. He said he was challenged by God to trust in him with his business, to go back to his policy of closing on Sundays, and he did, and his business has prospered. One of the largest businesses in America today. David's Christian faith runs deeper than his desire to have a profitable, successful company. And when he faces the decision of whether to make more money or to obey God, he chooses to obey God, whatever the consequences. Now, keep all that in mind and listen to this. This is where we're getting around to this subject. Recently, he was faced with a new test. It didn't come from a competitor. It came from the United States government. Part of the ObamaCare law requires employers not only to provide health care insurance to their employees, but also to provide free access to the pills that terminate pregnancies. And David, as I do and many others believe, and some don't believe, but we believe that life begins at conception, and offering an option to end that life would be in violation, in his case, of his moral compass as defined by his faith in Jesus Christ. Now, as a result, he said he would rather pay the $1.3 million a day in daily fines from the Obama administration than comply with the law. Here's a guy who feels so strongly in his beliefs that I think are consistent with the beliefs that made this country great, but that's just my belief, that he would pay $1.3 million a day in fines from the Obama administration rather than comply with this law. Today, the Obama administration is vigorously opposing Hobby Lobby's legal challenge to the mandate, claiming that this privately owned business is waging a war on women for not agreeing to provide these treatments for its employees free of charge. You know, that's just one example of what's happening. And by the way, in my state of Oklahoma, and I don't think we're that different from most other states. Last week, 4 universities in my great state of Oklahoma have filed a lawsuit against the federal government over the ObamaCare mandate to provide certain types of contraception to their employees. These are 4 universities joining with this one great American named David Green. And so we have now that the faith of an individual and the feeling that he has in what he's willing to do. And he is willing to stand up to this abusive government that we have today and to this law, this Obamacare law, and is willing to pay $1.3 billion a day. Now, you know, I look at this and I have strong feelings, just as strong as he has on this subject, but that's a subject for another day. You know, I always remember, I've got, my wife and I have 20 kids and grandkids. And back in the old days when we were having our kids, there was kind of a rule. You couldn't go in the hospital. I say my good friend who's occupying the chair. And so you couldn't see this. You had to kind of wait outside, and you didn't have all this notice of what the baby's going to be and all of that. But in this case, my first grandchild, I found out that my daughter called me up and said, all right, Daddy, come on over, it's time. And I went over into the hospital, and it was actually in the delivery room. What a great experience was that. My gosh, I never dreamed that ever happened. Now, we're talking about a number of years ago, 16 years ago, 17 years ago. And so I watched this take place, and I honestly, a tear did come out to my eye. At that time, we were talking about partial birth abortions, and the fact that they could have taken little baby Jace and jammed scissors into his skull and sucked his brains out. And that could have happened, but it didn't happen. So I feel just as strongly as he does. And the point I'm making here is, you know, you can make all the arguments about this, and I've made arguments on the floor during the Cruz debate. That I remember 19 years ago, Hillary Healthcare, the same thing. It was government taking over the healthcare system. And I have my friends in Parliament in Great Britain who call up and say, you know, what's wrong with you guys over there? Don't you realize that, you know, we are just getting away from this thing that hasn't worked? Socialized medicine. Now, don't kid yourself and think this isn't a road to socialized medicine if we end up not being able to do something about Obamacare. It is. In fact, the leader, I have a great respect for the leader of the Senate, Harry Reid. Senator Reid himself said, yes, I believe this is leading to, and I endorse, leading to the single-payer system. So we are talking about socialized medicine. They call up and say, hey, what's wrong with you guys? It hasn't worked here in Great Britain. It hasn't worked in Denmark. It hasn't worked in Canada. And yet you're somehow thinking it's going to work there. So that's kind of the big issue. We have an abusive government, and this is just probably the greatest single step that we've witnessed in the last 4.5 years as to the abuse that's taking place. And so I really believe that we need to look at the big picture, do something about this. And you say it can't be done now, it's too late. You're probably right now. But they said the same thing about Hillary Healthcare 19 years ago, and I'll never forget it. Because here I was on the plane going back to my state of Oklahoma with a stop in Chicago, and I thought we finally today drove the final nail in the coffin and killed Hillary Healthcare, and yet I picked up the Wall Street Journal, and there's a full-page ad by the AMA endorsing Hillary Healthcare because they had given up, and that was the day before they gave them that story. So anyway, it's never too late. This is something that needs to be stopped, and I have faith in the American people that somehow we're going to win this thing. I thank the chair. I know my time has expired.